I grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, which is not all that big in your part of the world. So I should say that the Church of the Nazarene is kind of like a conservative Methodism, or so it has a theology that encourages or is based on issues of love and sanctification and living right. And I grew up in that kind of environment. I was a very dedicated Bible study person. I was an evangelist. Um, and my change to becoming queer affirming happened when I was in seminary in my mid 20s. Um, I took a course in religious education, and as part of that course, we had to develop some curriculum for churches. And so, me and a couple of friends decided, well, let's explore this in what in those days we called the homosexuality question. And we did that using what's called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. We asked the question of how does it match with Scripture? How does it match with tradition? Does it fit experience? And is it reasonable? And using that fourfold matrix, I came to believe that, quote, homosexuality, again, the word we used in those days, could be compatible with full, authentic Christian faith. And
Mm.
then the question for me was, do I stay in this little denomination that, at least at that time, I thought was nowhere close to being becoming affirming? We weren't even having public conversations about these issues. And I
Mm.
ended up staying because, well, one, as I mentioned earlier, I think that love is the theological orienting concern for this denomination. And I thought the themes of love suggest that we ought to be fully queer affirming. But I also knew some other people in the denomination who were queer affirming. And I thought maybe if we kind of stuck together, we could create a bit of a movement. And third, my goal was to be a university theology and philosophy professor. And I knew that for a lot of people, it's in university that they start asking questions about sexuality in general and their own sexuality in particular. And I thought that maybe I could be a resource. In those days, we didn't use the word ally, but that's what I was thinking I might be able to be.
Mm. Mm. And over the between then and where you are today, I imagine you've had countless conversations that have been pretty tricky at a relational level before even the theological level. How have you found, particularly when speaking with people who are non-affirming, what's your approach been? And I'm sure that has changed over the years in not necessarily trying to go in trying to change people's minds, but just having those open conversations, trying to open people up to new theological ideas, or just trying to have people open to where the spirit might be moving. When at a starting point, it seems like there's an impasse there with affirming and
Yeah.
non-affirming Christians.
Well, for the first roughly 15 years or so after that, I was very careful in how I talked about these issues because I saw myself as an insider in the denomination, thinking that insiders have certain abilities to bring about change that outsiders don't. And so I not only tried to help students think through these things, but I helped other people as well. And I found that amongst the scholars in the denomination, there was a much warmer reception to what I had to say. But I felt guilty a lot during that time, to be honest, Jonty, because when you're someone like me and you feel like love compels you to be fully queer affirming and to preach that good news to people, and yet you're in an institution that won't allow it without me losing my job, I, I, I always feel like I could have been doing more, you know.
Mm.
I wanted to be at the front of the parade rather than it behind the scenes. And
Mm.
so those years, my strategy was more stealth oriented, more meeting with my students who were really academically inclined to walk through these things or students who had questions. In 2015, I lost my job at the university, not over this issue, but over just in general being too progressive for at least some local leadership. And the president who fired me ended up leaving as well, resigning. It was a big deal here in the States. But after that happened, and I was no longer closely associated with the university, I felt a kind of freedom to be at the start of the parade, to use that analogy again. And then my arguments became more overt, making the claim that love compels us to not only accept queer people, but to affirm them in their healthy sexual behavior and identities and orientation.
Mm. Did much change in the way people interacted with you at that point when you became much more overt in how you were approaching that, or was it pretty
Well, I
similar?
mean, the more conservative people saw me as a bigger threat
Mm.
because I am a fairly influential person in the Church of the Nazarene and in various places, and so to have someone with influence making the kind of arguments I was making, that was not looked upon positively by more
Mm.
conservative people. Queer people and allies, of course, were happy that I was more vocal. I think the folks who were most bothered by this were not necessarily the conservatives because they had kind of already written me off, you know. I think the people who were most bothered were people in leadership in the denomination who had to now try to deal with this theologian who's, going public with all these things, and people who considered themselves moderate on this issue. Like they weren't fully queer affirming, but they also weren't queer haters. And
Mm.
they saw themselves as good Wesleyans striking the middle way between two extremes. And to me, for me to come out and say right to their faces, your position is not loving, well, that pissed a bunch of them off
Mm.
because they saw themselves as the middle between two unloving positions, and I was denying them that claim.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Which, in my experience, when there's a fundamental quote unquote truth that's being challenged, like, you know, be, suggesting that one's behavior is not loving, which gets to the core of what Christian discipleship looks like, really, is
Yeah.
based on love. There's almost like a, a response that, like, gets past any, like, cognition. It's like an instant response about, like, when you start to poke at things that are so at the pillar of someone's discipleship and at the pillar of someone's theological understanding of the world, that I always try and remind myself to have a bit of empathy, like, because a lot of the time people's big outward response to being challenged on things comes from a deep sense of insecurity almost, or a deep sense of, you know, at the very least, an attachment to something that is vital and at the core of their own spiritual being. And so we have to tread really lightly, I find, sometimes as well, when particularly whether it's LGBTQI plus affirming stuff or all sorts of other things, when we lovingly try and challenge people to be more loving, when that can tread on some of the really tricky spots that people just involuntarily have a reaction to. And I'm sure you found that over
Yeah,
and over and over, for
it's an
sure.
ongoing discernment I'm in, trying to know how to engage people in a way that's honest, in a way that's empathetic, and is really loving toward them.
Mm.
And I think for some people, the questions of queer matters are kind of like the question of whether you like to spend time in nature or you'd rather spend time in the city. Um, that argument, if you're a nature lover, you can make all kinds of arguments for why it's psychologically helpful to be in nature. And if you're an urban lover, you can talk about the power of community. And there are deep-seated feelings people have in that argument. But at the end of the day, I'm going to say, well, hey, there's advantages to both, and I can walk
Mm,
away. But when it
mm,
comes to the queer issue, because I know so many queer people who struggle with mental health issues because they've been ostracized, they've been marginalized, they've been told by Christians they're sinners and they're sinful, the damage I think is genuine, and I'm more likely to be blunt in my interactions with people who are not queer affirming. I don't want to be um, I don't want to be dismissive of them. I want to
mm.
listen to them, what they're having to say, but I think the stakes are too high to just pretend like it's a question of whether it's better to spend time in nature or in the city.